Hi and welcome back to another Retronaut video. So in the first chapter in this series, we looked at the genesis of the Apple II. And we saw how it sprang from a combination of a lower cost processor, the 6502, combined with the goals that Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs had to take this personal computer to the next level. In those first years, the Apple II was certainly a success, but that doesn't mean that it ran away with a microcomputing crown. And the reason for this was it was in steep competition with two other computers. If you look at sales alone, then you can see that it was actually the Tandy TRS-80, which actually had a much bigger success in terms of sales. And it did this by hitting a much sweeter spot. It went on sale for $500, and it also came along with its own dedicated monitor as standard, so it was much better value for money than the Apple II. But the Apple II did go on to carve out a niche for itself, basically in the higher end of the hobbyist market, and also in business microcomputing as well. Now, within the trio of competitors, which was the Commodore PET, the Tandy TRS-80, and the Apple II, there were a number of factors, such as the machine's perceived market, the way that Apple assumed that this machine was going to sell into the computing market, their own experience as a company, and possibly also, its very fast development time. But it's probably a combination of all three of these factors, and the result of them was that there were some pretty obvious mistakes made with the Apple II. If you look back retrospectively, you can see that there were some pretty major issues as it went into market. So let's take a look now at what these issues were and how Apple addressed them between the Apple II's launch in 1977 and its first new iteration, the Apple II Plus, which was released 2 years later in 1979. So when the Apple was launched, Apple received feedback from a number of its users and also actually from some of its investors as well, and we'll talk about that a bit later. The top of their list of gripes were three different things. Number one, Apple's BASIC. It could only do integer maths. And this meant it wasn't really suitable for anything complex mathematically because you couldn't do accountancy, most scientific calculations, etc. Obviously, they rely on decimal maths. So it wasn't really suitable for anything like that. The tape drive itself was kind of standard really for machines of that era, but all the same, it was very slow, it was unreliable, and it was cumbersome. It was difficult to use. And customers, very quickly started to ask for a disk drive to make the machine much more practical to use. Another problem was that the machine in ROM only had uppercase characters, and that meant that business-centric users, they couldn't really use it for sending letters to clients and things like that because it just wasn't acceptable to send letters, in all uppercase. So Apple looked at these problems and they decided to tackle integer BASIC and the lack of a disk drive as the two top priorities, as they felt that the machine really was aimed mainly at the hobbyist market. But all the same, they felt that those two issues were the key features that people really had to have as soon as possible. The obvious candidate to fixing the floating point support in their own BASIC was Steve Wozniak. After all, don't forget he'd actually written the entire interpreter himself in the first place. However, he was also obviously the person to head up a new project to make a new floppy drive. So what did Apple do? They had to make a choice between the two things. Well, a year before Apple II was released, Bill Gates over at Microsoft was working on an implementation of the BASIC interpreter to run on a MOS 6502 processor. This was a generic version of BASIC. It would run basically on any machine that had a 6502 in it. Now, as a key product for Microsoft, this was the only thing that they did after all. They did software. It was important that it was very well featured. So their version of BASIC was well fleshed out, and it included support for floating point mathematics. So when Microsoft learned that Apple had a 6502 based machine in the works, they reached out to them and they asked if they were interested in licensing their new BASIC to use on their machine. Now at this point, Microsoft were a little bit desperate because they didn't actually have any customers for their BASIC, and it would have been a big fillip to them if they actually could have got Apple to license their product. It would have given them some further funds to work with. But unfortunately, Steve Jobs responded that they didn't need a BASIC because they actually had their own implementation already. Now, of course, Steve Jobs at that point didn't know that when the Apple II was released, that people would find their version of BASIC to be deficient. But pretty soon, he'd be returning to Microsoft with some interest. As soon as the machine was launched, customer feedback came rolling in, and they were demanding that floating point mass was implemented in Apple BASIC. And it was pretty clear to Jobs, Wozniak, and the rest of the Apple team what approach they should take. It was decided that Wozniak, who was their hardware prodigy, he would go to work on a new floppy system, as he already had some experience in that area. At the same time, Jobs would reach out to Microsoft. He would work out some kind of a deal with them to get the BASIC which he had previously refused and get that working in the Apple II. I mean, to be fair, despite being over a bit of a barrel, Apple made quite a shrewd deal of licensing Microsoft 6502's BASIC for their machines, because they made a deal where they had the right to use the BASIC for an 8-year period, and it only cost them $31,000. It was just a flat fee. Microsoft also agreed that Apple could brand their BASIC as AppleSoft BASIC, using a sort of conjugation between Apple and Microsoft. Well, the soft part of Microsoft anyway. However, I must say, it really feels like Jobs got away with one on Bill Gates on this one, because it was really, really common in those days to take a word and stick soft on the end of it as a name for a software company or a piece of software. So it was a pretty generic name, and you wouldn't necessarily know from the name that Microsoft had any involvement in it whatsoever. So really, AppleSoft sounds like it was actually produced 100% by Apple in-house. That's what I would say anyway. Now, in return for this favorable deal, Apple would actually then cede the rights to their own BASIC to Microsoft at the end of the 8-year period. And also they had the right to carry on with the deal and carry on using Microsoft BASIC in their products. So it seemed like a win-win situation for Apple. So with the deal agreed, Apple set about adapting the generic Microsoft BASIC to be compatible with AppleSoft BASIC. And this proved actually to be quite a difficult process. The main problem was they didn't have a 6502 assembler at the time. So they looked around on the market and they couldn't see anything that made any sense to them. But they did find that there was a remote time-sharing machine. In other words, a computer that you would dial into using a modem and then pay money to actually use it during a certain period of time. And they then used this by connecting to it via a modem. And they then started to write their code on this machine and then compile it. And then they would get that machine code back and then they would run that on their Apple IIs. But this proved to be expensive, and it also proved to be very cumbersome as well. And things came to a head when the remote computer had a system failure of some kind, and they actually lost all of the source code for their BASIC. So you can imagine how much that stung, paying for the service and then obviously losing their source code, which is basically their work gone down the drain. So they decided to try and think of a different way that they could do this. And one of their team's coders, Cliff Houston, was actually working on the BASIC project. He had an IMSI 8080. And if you remember from the last episode, that was a microcomputer that came out in the previous generation before the big three. It was actually released in 1975. But it was a little bit more sort of capable at that point, and it did actually have a 6502 assembler on it. So they decided to use Cliff's own IMSI 8080 to actually produce AppleSoft BASIC on. So by bringing in a solution, just buying software commercially, and then getting it to compile and then working very hard on it, they managed to get it working in pretty short order. And I think that's actually pretty remarkable what they did. Now, it was initially distributed on tape because in the beginning, that was the only solution that they had. And obviously customers found that to be a bit of a chore, because to use AppleSoft BASIC, you had to put in a tape, press play, wait for it to load, which probably took a couple of minutes. And then once it was loaded, let's say you had a piece of software that you were working on, you then have to pop that in, another tape in, and then obviously load up that software, write your software, save it back to tape when you were finished, and then the next day, rinse and repeat. So yeah, it was a pretty clunky process to actually use AppleSoft BASIC at first. Because of this, actually quite a few customers still carried on actually using Integer BASIC because it was still available on ROM, it was free, and for a lot of cases it was actually perfectly viable to use. But yeah, for a lot of customers it wasn't. Now, as I said, Wozniak was working on a floppy disk system, and we'll talk about that a little bit later. But when that actually was available, they then started to sell AppleSoft Basic on floppy, which obviously made it much more practical because now you could copy AppleSoft Basic, put that in your drive, boot it up, and then have your software on the same floppy disk, which made it much easier to actually then load that software. And it kept it all together on a single floppy disk, which obviously made things a lot easier. Now, that obviously brought quite a big leap in productivity. But the ultimate solution for Apple was to distribute AppleSoft Basic on ROMs. So if you remember in the last episode, we looked at the ROMs in this machine, somewhere around here. The idea was that you would buy these ROMs, part of the deal of actually buying AppleSoft Basic, and then you would put these ROMs into your machine, and then when you turned on your machine, it would boot up immediately with AppleSoft Basic. Another solution was there was a ROM card, and I think we talked about that in the last video. That was also another solution where you could actually put a card in here and you would fit the ROMs into that card as well. I'm not sure why you would need to do that. I would assume that you could just replace the ROMs on your board. But anyway, some people decided to do that. I know what it was. It was because there was a switch on it at the back, which meant you could turn that card off, which meant you could then basically boot up the machine and use integer basic, or turn it on, boot up the machine, and you were immediately into AppleSoft Basic. So yeah, AppleSoft Basic got them out of the hole that they dug themselves with integer basic. So I mentioned earlier about the investors in the company, and one of them was a guy called Mike Markula, and he was a very key figure in the early days of Apple. He was a previous employee of Intel. Because of his work there, he'd become pretty wealthy by the time that Apple, formed. And as a result of this, he became one of their early investors, one of their key investors, in fact. Mike was a technical person, and he'd actually been writing his own check balancing, for writing out checks to send money to people. He'd been writing his own check balancing system in BASIC at home, to help himself with his own finances. And he'd found that using a tape drive was, very, very painful. As I described earlier, especially for AppleSoft Basic, he'd have to load up BASIC, load up his application, do some coding, blah, 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 save it out to tape. Yeah, it was a bit of a torture. So one day he ends up in a conversation with Wozniak, and he's stating very strongly that a floppy drive would really, really help to take the Apple II to the next level. Don't forget, Mike is an investor in this machine, literally, and he wanted to see this machine fly. So his feedback was pretty strong. So Wozniak had to think about this, and it turned out that when he had been working at Hewlett-Packard just before he actually quit to join Apple and launch the company, he'd actually worked on his own disk controller. And what he'd done is he got a Shurgard drive. Now, Shurgard were the originators of the floppy disk drive, basically. And he had got a hold of a Shurgard drive, and he just had the bare mechanism. He didn't have the control board on it. And he made a little project where he tried to create his own control board to get the Shurgard drive to work with a computer he was using. So he had some experience, some knowledge of that drive, and this idea about making their own controller seemed like a really good idea to him. You've got to realize that at this point, floppy disk drives were very, very expensive. And this seemed like, it was going to be outside the realms of the budgets of most of their customers to actually get a floppy disk drive on the Apple II. But Wozniak had these ideas. He had some kind of ideas of how you could reduce the cost. So he really sort of thought outside the box. And it was agreed that they would get 25 mechanisms from Shurgard, and he would then try and do the same kind of thing that he'd done there, except for the Apple II. So he would make his own controller, which would mean that they would get the drives at a much, much more reduced cost. They would keep it simple. They would cut corners. So another idea that Wozniak had was, it was very common at the time to put a processor on the inside of the disk drive to process the data, to control the heads of the drive, to basically make it work. And this was one of the key costs of the machine. He realized, of course, that he had a very capable processor inside the Apple II. He had a 6502 from MOS. And he thought, well, why don't we get that to do the heavy lifting? There was one downside to this, because whilst the drive was accessing data, the CPU would be basically maxed out doing that work. Now, later on, this would have been an issue. I mean, for instance, when the Apple Macintosh was made, Apple decided that they wanted to have some kind of semblance of multitasking, the ability to do multiple tasks at the same time. So at that point, they invested in putting the SCSI bus into their machines. And the SCSI bus had its own processor on board, and that meant the drives basically worked independently of the operating system. You could tell a drive to load some data, and it would work with the SCSI bus, and it would actually do that automatically and load that directly into memory. Now, with a simple machine like an Apple II, people just didn't expect that level of flexibility. They didn't expect multitasking. When you loaded data off tape, it wasn't like you would then load up another program and listen to some music or, browse the web like we do today. It was perfectly normal to load in a piece of software, go off and make a cup of coffee, come back, and then the software would be ready to use by the time you came back. So, this was a common thing in 8-bit machines at the time, so he decided that it wasn't really going to be an issue. This wasn't a mini computer. It didn't have to multitask. It was perfectly fine for the machine to basically be locked up while it was loading data. So this sounded like a pretty cool economization. So Jobs was on board with this need, and Wozniak then set about making it happen. So this new project was called the Disk II system, and it was branded that way, so then fitted in with Apple II. Apple II, Disk II. And it was launched eventually in June of 1978, which again is pretty remarkable because it only took him just about a year to actually get it ready from the initial launch of the Apple II. It cost $495 on launch, and I think that's something like $2,000 today. It sounds like a great deal of money, and that's because it was. But you have to bear in mind that the actual computer itself cost what? $1,300 pretty much. So, going on for being almost a third of its price. And the Apple II customer base was pretty affluent, so it looks like they could afford it. It actually came with a controller card, and this was required to make the drive work with the machine. And you put it into, I think it was slot 6 here. On the card, there were 2 ports, and that meant that if you wanted to, you could buy a second drive, and you'd actually have a 2-drive system, which was actually a pretty common thing for customers to actually go for back in those days. The Disk II system was a very effective solution. It was the cheapest floppy solution at that time on a microcomputer, and it was also actually the fastest solution because of the work that Wozniak had done. And what that meant was, when it went on sale, people lapped it up. People loved it. And it was very, very common for people to buy 1 or 2 drives. And especially, I showed you in the last episode, the Tower of Power, put 2 drives on top of the case and put your monitor on top of that. This took the machine from being a very much a tape-based solution to being a capable floppy disk solution in a very short period of time. And that meant that it basically became sort of standard kit for almost everybody who had an Apple computer. This meant the tape drive was something of a memory. And what that actually meant was, and I can see this from an external viewpoint because I was never an Apple II owner back in the day. I was a Commodore 64 owner. What you found on the Commodore 64 was we were trapped on the Commodore 64 in tape land for about, I think it was about 2 years, which meant that you could only really buy very simple software. Applications weren't really a thing. It was mostly video games. And if you had a video game where you had to save your data to tape, it was horrible. On the other side of the pond, back in 78, people were now able to put an application in on a floppy disk, put another floppy disk in the other drive to save onto. Or you could have video games, for instance, that had the main data for the game on one drive and then your save game or other data on the other drive. Obviously, you still probably had to do a bit of disk swapping every now and again, but basically it was infinitely better than, doing things on tape. So yeah, this is 1978 and already people on the Apple II working in a much more powerful way with these floppy-based workflows. So another innovation from Apple was an expansion card, which was branded as the language card, which is a little bit confusing because it actually had nothing to do with spoken language. It was to do with programming languages. It was released in 1979, so we're talking a couple of years later, and it was actually more of a sort of mixed function card, and it included 3 main features. It had 64K of RAM on board. It also had the Pascal programming language. I think it was on a ROM on the card. And as I said, because of the Pascal language, that's why it was the language card. And finally, there was a little tweak on there as well, a little ROM tweak. And what that did was when you actually put floppy disks into your drives, if you put it into the first drive and you turned on your Apple II, it would automatically boot off that floppy disk. So again, that made the machine a lot easier to use. Apple was definitely busy between 1977 and 1979. But as we'll find out a little bit later, they didn't really have their eye totally on the Apple II ball. And I think this actually caused a bit of a problem because I honestly think, looking back in retrospect, that this is where Apple lost a lot of momentum, especially against the machines that were about to hit the market. I'm talking about the VIC-20. May not seem a bit of a competitor, but believe me, it was, because soon after you had the Commodore 64. You also had the Spectrum in the UK, which was just a super, super cheap machine, and yet remarkably capable if you compare it to the Apple II. It's probably going to be running as fast as it. It's got better graphics than it. It's got better sound. Well, pretty much the same sound, BP sound, but then, you know, the Apple II only really had BP sound. So really, by the time these machines came out, the Apple II should have been going off into the distance, but it wasn't. So, you know, it's a pity because I think up until about 1979, it was actually doing really well. So anyway, by 1979, it was clear to most at Apple that AppleSoft Basic, the auto boot feature on the language card, and also some more RAM would really make a lot of sense in an Apple II as standard. Obviously, they could sell Apple IIs with these things as standard, but that would make costs pretty high. So they decided that they had to obviously integrate these things into the machine, and they set about creating a new model of Apple II. And in June of 1979, Apple released the Apple II Plus. And this went on sale for an initial price of $1,195, which is roughly $100 cheaper than the original machine, which is pretty cool, but still not cheap. We're still talking about a machine which cost $6,159 in today's money. I would describe this as very much an evolutionary update to the original Apple. It's nothing revolutionary, but it would have been definitely a welcome addition to the range because you could now buy this machine and have a number of features standard. So the first of these was that it was now shipped with 16K of RAM as standard. If you can remember, the original machine shipped with 4K. And at the same time, it could still be upgraded to 48K because you had the sockets on the logic board, which were easily accessible by this door here. So you could upgrade the machine to 48K yourself if you needed to. The auto boot code from the language ROM, that was then rolled into the Apple II system ROMs, and that meant it would automatically boot if you put a floppy disk in and booted the machine. And now AppleSoft Basic finally became a standard part of the machine. Previously, it was only available on tape and disk, but now it was actually included on the main system ROMs on the logic board. So now you turned on the machine, and as soon as it was turned on, you were in AppleSoft Basic. That was fantastic. And on top of that, Apple took the opportunity to actually update AppleSoft Basic as well. And they put some features which until that point had only actually been available in the original Integer Basic. So it was actually a more rounded out AppleSoft Basic as well. Another thing that they did, and this wasn't necessarily standard, but it was very common, was that pluses were very often supplied with a language card, which may seem a little bit weird. But the reason for that was, if you remember, the language card had 16K of RAM on it. And that meant that when you actually had those installed in the machine, you either had 32K or it would actually max out the memory of the machine if you had 48K. It would take the machine up to basically 64K, which for the time was a really good amount of RAM. That would have been a pretty high-end machine. Now, a major problem with the Apple II, as we discussed in the last video, was that it didn't have any radio frequency shielding in it. This was something that Atari, for instance, took very seriously in their machines. They had these incredibly big aluminium chassis, and that meant that those machines had very good RF shielding. On the flip side, the Apple had nothing. And that meant if you used an Apple II in a room with a television, let's say you had an Apple in the corner of your room and a TV in the other corner, you couldn't watch the TV because there would be so much radio frequency interference coming from your Apple II that the television picture would be absolutely awful. So yeah, that was a big problem. So to address that, Apple put a brass mesh inside the new II Plus case, and this really helped reduce the RF interference. Apple was doing well. It had some success in the USA, some ongoing success with the Apple II. So at this point, they decided to try and launch this machine into the European and Japanese markets. So they produced two models of Plus, which were called the Apple II Euro Plus and the Apple II J Plus. These, of course, required changes to the video display. For instance, in Europe, it had to use PAL instead of working with NTSC. And if you watch the previous video, we looked at how Wozniak had done a very clever hack to get the Apple II working with NTSC, which was a North American standard, television standard. But that wasn't going to work in Europe. So they had to make adaptations there to actually get it to work with PAL. Another thing, of course, was you had foreign languages in Europe, not just English. So they also had to give you the ability to change the keyboard to make something which was, a bit more suitable to the market that it was sold into. So now Apple had an opportunity to sell into these two new markets and get a hold, hopefully, in Europe and Japan. However, because of the exchange rates, also don't forget you would have had import duty and various other factors, they both really didn't make that much of a headway in either market, as far as I'm aware. They definitely didn't really have major penetration into the European market. Anyway, that's about it really for the Apple II Plus, except there was a little development in 1980, between 1980 and 1979. RAM prices took a massive drop in that period. Apple then decided that because of that drop, it didn't make sense anymore to fit the machine with 16K. I think they were mindful of up and coming competition, so they decided to beef up the standard RAM from 16K to 48K, which is basically the maximum amount of RAM that you can have in this machine without having the language card. So at that point in 1980, if you had one of those bundles where you got an Apple II with 48K, plus you had the language card, you now had a machine, an Apple II with 64K in it, AppleSoft Basic. Yeah, I mean, it must have been an amazing improvement over the original Apple II. If you think about it, in 1977, you had a machine with 4K in it, and now you have a machine with 64K. You can have your disk drives with it. It must have been a fantastic machine to use at that time. Very, very sweet. And I think definitely Apple should have really monopolized on it. Let's move on now, and we'll take a look at its successor, which came a number of years later, and we'll talk about why that happened. And that machine was the Apple IIe, which is the computer that you can see here. So during the following period, relatively little actually came out from Apple for the Apple II in the next 3 years. And this may seem odd when you think about it, because up until 1979, the Apple II was their only computer that they actually had at retail. However, soon after launch of the original Apple II model, Apple carried out some market research, and they discovered something that was actually quite interesting and they didn't expect, because they found out that about 90% of their computers were actually sold to businesses, or at least small businesses. And this surprised them. So they thought to themselves, what are we going to do about this? They'd aimed the Apple II more at the sort of home user, hobbyists and the like. And because of this, they'd made certain compromises, which obviously compromised it as a business machine. For instance, its lack of lowercase characters, that was a big issue. So behind the scenes, a new project was started. They decided that they weren't going to continue with the Apple II as their main platform. They were going to try and replace it with a new machine in pretty much the same way as they'd replaced the original Apple I with the Apple II. This project was called Project Sarah. So that project was aimed at the business users. The 90% of sales, which makes sense, were going to businesses, and they decided that they were going to make a machine specific to that market. They projected that once they completed that project and it went on sale, that this new machine would be snapped up by its business customers, and then pretty much in short order, the Apple II could be taken off the market because it wouldn't be needed anymore. Apple decided that the home user base wasn't really part of their future. As this new platform was planned to be pretty much compatible with the Apple II as well, Apple decided that they were going to call it the Apple III, as they thought it was going to be the distinct inheritor of the Apple II market. As we learned in the last video, have a look here at the link to see where we talk about this. Steve Jobs had a particular dislike of fan noise, noisy computers, and he didn't want to have any sort of unsightly vents in the case of the machine. And the same person that actually worked on the case for the Apple II must have had deja vu, because there were certain decisions made by Steve Jobs which meant that the heat issue actually came back to bite the Apple III project really, really badly. So yeah, there were some compromises in the design, and that meant that they decided to use an aluminium heatsink. That led to issues with production. That actually meant that there were issues with the way that the machine was built. But ultimately, what most customers actually complained about once it was launched was the overheating. The overheating was apparently so bad that when you left the machine on for a while, you would actually get glitching on the characters on screen. Obviously, it was causing issues with the connection probably between the ROMs and the sockets. But that wasn't the only thing that would happen. There would be crashing as well. And also, some customers even actually said that when they put floppy disks in, they would actually emerge from the floppy drive melted, or at least warped anyway. So again, Apple had a very severe heat problem, which is kind of crazy because you think they would have learned about that when they didn't put the vents onto the Apple II in the first iteration. But the problem was that the perception of the machine was already very, very badly damaged in the public imagination. You can imagine how many articles were in the magazines at the time talking about this major issue. And this meant basically that the Apple III was doomed. It did roll on for a while, but it actually was discontinued just a couple of years later. So yeah, that was major, sort of egg on Apple's face. And even worse than that, you can imagine that all of these resources that were diverted away from the Apple II, they had gone into the Apple III, and it meant that the Apple II was pretty much stagnant, withering on the vine in those 3 years. And Apple had bet pretty much the farm on the Apple III success, and now they were watching, at least metaphorically, that farm going up in smoke. So, this was a real disaster at Apple, and this could have been the end of the company, I suppose. However, they did make a good decision, and they decided not to discontinue the Apple II. Let's face it, they didn't really have a choice. And they decided to try and get some of the technology which they developed for the Apple III into the Apple II, so at least they could salvage some of their hard work and at least, push the Apple II a little bit forward. So this led to them producing a new model of the Apple II around 1983. It was in actually January 1983, and they called this machine the Apple IIe. Now, the E in the Apple IIe stands for enhanced. And I've got to say, when you consider how basic the original machine was back in 1977, and the fact that it had all these additional enhancements from the Apple II plus the new enhancement, I think the name made sense. So the E sold for a price of $1,395, which is $7,189 in 2024 money. Now, I've got to say this is a bit of a surprise. It's quite a large price rise over the Apple II Plus. And you've got to bear in mind as well that this machine had a lot of work done in it to actually cut costs, because Apple actually integrated a lot of the chips on this machine to actually make the logic board a lot simpler, at least compared to the Apple II, and certainly compared to the Apple II Plus. So yeah, it's quite a surprise that the price went up. But, you did get quite a few enhancements. The other thing to bear in mind about this machine, and this is what's actually quite remarkable about it, is that it is basically the last Apple II that would ever be in production apart from the Apple IIe card. Now, the Apple IIe card wasn't a true Apple II. It didn't have a keyboard. It wasn't a machine on its own. It was actually inside a Macintosh. So in reality, this is actually the last Apple II that they would actually have on sale, although it was a further iteration of the Apple IIe, which happened in the next years ahead. So yeah, I think that's actually quite amazing that this machine went on to be on the market actually for altogether about 16 years. It wasn't the biggest selling machine, the biggest selling micro in the world, but it did have incredible longevity if you think about it starting with the Apple II and going all the way to 93 with this particular model. What enhancement did it have? Well, it had quite a few. So this model finally introduced the full ASCII character set, which meant for the first time on an Apple II, at least in a built-in capacity, you had lowercase characters. And on top of that, you had the full ASCII character set. To go along with that enhancement, you have a new keyboard, which has arrow keys. And it also has, for the first time, the open and closed Apple symbols for options, plus a few other enhancements along the way as well. So that was really cool. It also had 64K as standard for the first time. And I've got to say, really, at this point, I think it kind of had to do that, because you've got to think about this is 1983. And what had been launched in 1982? Well, the Commodore 64. And the Commodore 64 obviously had 64K of RAM, and it also had better graphics than the Apple II. It had way better sound than the Apple II, and it cost, I think it was $500 when it was launched in 1982. But very, very quickly, the Commodore 64 dropped in price down to $200. It was £200 over here in the UK when I bought mine. So Apple at this point had, pretty major competition from a machine that was so cheap. Commodore had really taken its time coming out with a successor, a true successor really to the Commodore PET. But when they did, they really came out with something of an Apple slayer. Of course, the Apple II was a more mature platform, and it would take a while for the Commodore 64 to get a disk drive. So at least for the first couple of years, the Commodore 64 was kind of trapped in using tapes. And as we discussed earlier, that's pretty horrible. So the Apple II still had an advantage in that respect. Now, another Apple III technology that was ported across to the Apple IIe was memory banking. And what you've got to bear in mind is that there is a reason why the Commodore 64 was called that, had 64K of memory, and there was a reason why it had 64K of memory. It's because the 6502 and also the processor in the Commodore 64 couldn't actually address anything more than 64K natively. But Apple had developed bank switching, which meant you could have another 64K of RAM, and you could actually swap between the two banks fluidly. So this meant that for the first time, the Apple II could actually use more than 64K of RAM. And they actually allowed it to use 128K of RAM. To make this work, they had to change the Apple expansion slots, and they got rid of slot 0. And they added a new slot in front of slot 3. They called it the auxiliary slot. And if you had a memory card placed in the slot, it could actually take advantage of this memory banking system and expand the machine up to a full 128K of RAM, which is actually, really cool, actually. To go along with this, Apple released an extended 80-column card. They called it that because the card actually had a little bit of RAM on the card, so you didn't have to use any of the memory on the card to actually enable the 80-column mode. And along with that little bit of video RAM, it also had a full 64K. So with that card in the machine, you now had a machine that had 80-column mode, which made it even better for business use. And the 64K would then give it 128K. So at this point, with that card installed, the machine actually became a really decent business machine, I think. But I'm not really sure that was enough because, you got to remember that in 1981, IBM had released the 5150 PC. That was a very expensive machine, but it did have some pretty compelling features. Also had expansion slots, as we saw in the Apple II, but it had a very good keyboard. It had a higher RAM limit than the Apple II, especially at the time. Don't forget when the IBM machine came out, I think it could do up to 256K of RAM if you expanded it, whilst the Apple at the time would have been locked down at 64K. So I think, to be honest, the horse had kind of got out of the stable, and I don't think that Apple was going to, cement its place as the prime business platform. Unfortunately, it was just too little too late. They'd bet the farm on the Apple III, and unfortunately that, as we said, just went up in flames. And yeah, it doesn't look like it was enough to really, as I said, cement the machine as a business machine. One other change that they made, and I've got to say it's about time, is that they got rid of the V-shaped slots on the back of the case, and they replaced it with a bunch of different custom size slots, which would actually allow you to fit different expansion sockets into those slots. And then you could actually cinch those down with bolts. And that, became the sort of standard way that we see expansions on the back of machines pretty much until today. It's a much better solution, and I really think they should have done it in the Apple II Plus. But anyway, they did actually manage to get it done for the Apple IIe. That's really cool that they finally got rid of those sort of janky slots in the back, and they had a more professional solution. I just wonder why it took them so long. I think it must have been, the fact that all the resources went on the Apple III, really. I think that was the issue. So this is the Apple IIe that you can see here. And I have to say, from my perspective, I think it's probably the best model that you can buy these days. I think that, unfortunately, you could buy an Apple II Plus as well. A Euro Plus, obviously, if you're over in Europe, or a J Plus if you're in Japan. Now, why wouldn't I buy an original Apple? Well, There are a number of reasons. Number one, I'd have to sell my car probably to afford one. That's one issue. Number two, it is a very basic machine. I personally don't have the nostalgia for using that level of basicness, you know, not having AppleSoft Basic, although I don't really code in AppleSoft Basic, but anyway, it's in this machine. Not having auto boot with the disk drive, so on and so forth. The keyboard as well is actually not as good as the later keyboards. There are just so many reasons. Now, you can probably buy an original Apple II, but the problem is, unless you're being a purist about it, it's probably going to be expanded anyway to try and make it as close as possible to an Apple II Plus. If you want to get back closer to the original Apple experience, you could probably just get an Apple II Plus anyway, and you'd have a slightly less capable machine than this, but it would basically be like an expanded Apple II. Because of the additions to this machine, you know, the ability to have more memory, 128K, 80-column display, which I have in this machine. This machine, I believe, has 128K. I believe it can actually go larger as well in terms of memory. There were, you know, developments later as a better keyboard. The case is much more practical on the back, the way you attach expansion cards. And I'll show you what I actually have on the back of mine right now. This machine actually is in flux. I have some of the cards from this machine, I think, in my Apple II GS. And I need to have a look at this and see how I'm going to actually kit this out in the long term. But you can see on the back, it's a much better machine in the way it's put together in terms of the expansion ports on the back of it. So yeah, I would say, you know, this is definitely the machine that I would go for, especially if I was in Europe. Another problem, I think, with the Apple II, the original one, is, of course, it's only 110 volts. It was a USA only machine. The same thing for the Apple II Plus, unless you get one of the Euro Pluses or a J Plus, obviously, for Japan. So that would make it much more difficult to use. You know, having a 110 volt machine, there's always the possibility that I might cause an issue with it. And I'd obviously have to use a power transformer. And the other issue as well is, of course, is that it's designed for NTSC. So unless I actually have an NTSC monitor or television, I'm not going to be able to get color on it. I'm only going to be able to get monochrome graphics, really. So I don't think that's really acceptable either. So yeah, that's my opinion. If you want to get an Apple II, just go for an Apple IIe. It's probably cheaper. It's still expandable. You get the expansion card experience. I think it's a great machine to have. And I'm very happy that I did actually get one of these. I mean, I think the only other reason to get an Apple II Plus really, or an Apple II especially, is as an investment. If you wanted to be a collector and put it away in a cupboard for another 10 years and bring it out when it's worth £1 million, you know, $1 million, whatever. So yeah, the Apple IIe, very, very good machine. So that brings us to the end of this video. What we're going to do in the next video is we're going to look at the Apple IIc, and we're also going to look at the Apple II GS, and also some other small developments that happened towards the end of the lifespan of the Apple II system. They are actually a very interesting machine. I am a big fan of the Apple IIc design, although it's a big departure from this machine. We'll talk about that in that video. And I'm also quite a big fan of the Apple II GS as well. I think it's a machine that was compromised, to be honest. There were some strange decisions made right towards the end of its development and release, and I think that really sort of shackled it. And also we'll come back to the IIe. As I said, this was a machine that lasted right until the end, really, of the Apple II's lifespan. So yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, then please do click on the like button. And also, you know, if you haven't done so already, please subscribe to the channel, because I want to see you back here, hopefully, to see the concluding part of this small series. And until then, have a nice day. Take care.